Hello to our friends joining us via recording. We are starting lesson number 8 today. To help us get ready for everything we're covering in lesson number 8, we're doing a little bit of review of overlapping material between lecture and lab. So for my friends who are here, help me out in the chat. We need to identify our 3 types of tissue that we see here. So let's start with this one here in the middle. Can you type for me in the chat box, which kind of tissue do we see in the middle image here? What kind of tissue is that one? Yeah, that's my cartilage. Okay, so we will type that. I'll type it across. Hyaline cartilage. That's one of the types of tissue that we had to identify for lab. The reason we are seeing it again here in lecture is because of where we find it. Which of my statements on the left, which location on the left do I find hyaline cartilage in? Where's hyaline cartilage found? The primary place it's found. Yeah, so from lab, one of the big places we told you to learn hyaline cartilage is the fetal skeleton. So the fetal skeleton is made out of hyaline cartilage. When I turn that hyaline cartilage into the bone tissue that makes up your skeleton, we're doing a process that we'll probably talk about today called endochondral ossification. Endochondral ossification. That's how we take the fetal skeleton made out of cartilage and turn it into bone tissue. So the 2 other images that I see on my screen here are the 2 other types, or the 2 types of bone tissue. So let's call this type number 1, and let's call this one type number 2. Which of these, 1 or 2, shows me compact bone connective tissue? Which one is compact bone? Yeah, so the one I called number 2, that's my compact bone. Let's add its name on top of it, compact bone. When we talk about compact bone, where on my bones is compact bone found? Is that the one on the outside or the one on the inside of the bone? Compact bone. Yeah, a couple of us are chiming in the chat. Compact bone is what we find on the outside of our bones. This is what makes the outside of your bones look so smooth. This is also what makes your bones so strong. Remember that compact bone tissue is really compact. It's really squeezed together. So compact bone tissue on the outside, really great for attaching muscles to, for example. Also really good for making those bones strong. So my last type of tissue up here then, this weird looking picture up here. Which kind of tissue is this one? Yeah, we're a little nervous. We don't need to be nervous. It is spongy bone. Yep. It's one of my 2 ways that spongy bone can look. Let me move this a little bit. Some of my spongy bone images show kind of dark purple bone marrow. That's what I see here in between. Some of them show more of a red bone marrow, or sometimes there's even just kind of white space on the slide. All of that is the bone marrow though. So when we're asking about which of my types of tissue has bone marrow, that would be what the spongy bone would be the answer for that one. Yeah, I like the comment in the chat too, that we're typing as fast as we can. Yeah, I feel ya. So it's all good. I'll wait for us to type even though it takes a while, right? Okay, spongy bone has bone marrow. Hyaline cartilage in the fetal skeleton, compact bone found on the outside of our bones. Hey, which of these are types of connective tissue? Which of these tissues would we say is connective tissue? Yeah, Nicole is totally right. All of them are actually types of connective tissue. So connective tissue comes in many different varieties. Remember from lab, all of our favorites, right? I'm using sarcasm here. So our favorites like dense regular, dense irregular, and then we had all of our cartilages that counted as connective tissue. But then also our types of bones were both types of connective tissue. So was blood, actually. So remember we kind of said when we were learning our tissues, if you can't remember which of the 4 main tissue types you're looking at, your best bet is just to guess that it's connective tissue, because connective tissue comes in so many different appearances. So for my statement here asking which of these are connective tissues, all of these are actually connective tissues here. So my 2 types of bone tissue, compact and spongy, and my hyaline cartilage, all of those are technically connective tissue. I want to see if we can apply something really fast. On the outside of bones, bones are made out of compact bone. Can anyone help me out? We could also say that hyaline cartilage is found on the outside of bones. Does anyone remember where hyaline cartilage is found on the outside of bones? Do you remember what that kind of cartilage was called? So it's not found in the skull necessarily. Yes, so one of the places that Nicole mentioned was what we call the costal cartilage. The costal cartilage is what attaches the ribs to the sternum. Yeah, so attaching the ribs to the sternum is hyaline cartilage, the costal cartilages. And Nicole mentioned at the ends of long bones. So we see a lot of hyaline cartilage at most of the joints in the body. So your knuckles, for example, at the end of each of the phalanges in your fingers, we've got a thin little layer of hyaline cartilage to help provide some cushion, to make the bone tissue not rub together. Those are some of the functions of hyaline cartilage. So cartilage tissue is a lot more involved in enabling movement, whereas my bone tissues are a lot more involved in making things strong. So keep that in mind. There is part of the lesson that asks you to kind of compare and contrast their functions. If we're talking about something that makes the bone really strong, cartilage tissue isn't strong, but it's great to make sure that we don't do the rubbing. We don't want our bones rubbing together. So Jesse asked the question about when we pop our knuckles, because now we all want to, right? Because I mentioned them. Yeah, when we pop our knuckles, we are releasing little bubbles of air that's inside the joints in our knuckles. Let's remind ourselves, the joints that we find in our knuckles, what did we call that kind of joint? Lesson number 1. Yeah, so way back in lesson number 1, we talked about those synovial joints. Synovial joints have fluid in them. So when we pop the bubbles that are in that fluid, that's what you hear when you're cracking your knuckles, or when any other joint in your body is popping. It's because there's some fluid in there and we just popped the gas bubbles. So the corollary question that students always ask me when we talk about doing that is whether or not it's dangerous to do that, whether it's okay. So what I have read and my personal opinion is that as long as it's not hurting you when you pop your knuckles, you're probably okay. Yeah, or Jessie says that a lot of her joints pop a lot. Yeah, it's just releasing air. So as long as you're not stretching something out farther than it should, as long as we're not hurting something, you're just popping air bubbles. So air bubbles that are found in the fluid that's next to the cartilage that we have in those joints. All right, so our first 4 statements about our types of tissue, all of them connective tissues. We start off as a hyaline cartilage skeleton. We turn that hyaline cartilage into spongy bone and compact bone, and we store our bone marrow inside that spongy bone. Look at our next set of statements here. Our first 2 statements are asking us about the types of cells that we find in our tissues that we see here. When I call a cell an osteocyte, what does this osteo part refer to? What does osteo mean? Yeah, osteo means bone. So osteo equals bone. Anytime you see osteo, we're thinking bone. So osteocytes are the names of the cells that are in my spongy bone tissue that I see here. And it's the name of my cells that live in my compact bone tissue. In compact bone, the osteocytes look like the little black dots that you see here. When we're looking at spongy bone, it's kind of the little purple dots or red dots that we see inside the pink here. So osteocytes are found in both of my types of bone tissue. Anytime you see chondro, what did I tell you to think about when you see chondro? What does chondro mean? Yeah, chondro means cartilage. Fun fact, not related to our class, but I'm going to toss it out there to show you this word. There are things called, I'm going to probably spell this wrong because I don't actually teach this. There are things called chondroichthyes. Chondroichthyes. This is a group of animals that we classify together based on what their skeleton is made out of. Chondroichthyes. What would the skeleton of these fish be made out of? Not a trick question, I promise. Yeah, so chondroichthyes is actually the classification we use for sharks. They have a cartilage skeleton, chondroichthyes. So this beginning part, chondro, doesn't just apply to humans. It doesn't just apply to the cartilage in our joints or the cartilage in our ribs. Chondro is a prefix that applies even to fish. Chondroichthyes. So I will not put that on the test or any of your homework assignments, but I just got to toss it out there because, you know, nerd alert over here. Chondroichthyes, I'm stuck now, right? Chondrocytes are the types of cells that we find in cartilage tissue. So remember that my cartilage tissue, I've got my hyaline cartilage here. So hyaline cartilage, these little, we called them kind of deer tracks in the snow, these sets of two cells, those are my chondrocytes. The cells that I see in compact bone and the cells that I see in spongy bone, those are my osteocytes. Yeah, Jesse says, extra credit question. It's true. would be a good one, right? To see who's here and who's watching the videos. All right, next statement here talks about trabeculae. Which of my types of tissue did we say in lab had trabeculae? That's a lab word. Yep. Trabeculae are found in spongy bone. I'll put a little arrow here. All the pink stuff that I'm seeing here that's actually the bone tissue, that is my trabeculae. Technically, what trabeculae means, technically speaking, is its little beams. But remember that what I told you guys to think of it as too is kind of like fingers. So my type of bone tissue that has these little beams or these little fingers in it, that's spongy bone. Remember that I have to have these spongy bone fingers so that there's space to store the bone marrow inside of it. Yeah, Nicole asked a good question. She's asked if the osteocytes are in the trabeculae. That is correct. Yes. So the trabeculae is the bone tissue itself. So instead of having osteons, that's the arrangement that I use to describe compact bone tissue. Instead of having osteons, I have little fingers of bone that there's space in between them. And that bone tissue is where those bone cells live. So the bone cells are inside these little trabeculae here, and they live with each other in the bone tissue. The bone marrow is found around those fingers. I appreciate that, Jacqueline. Thank you. I do my best to try to explain things for you guys, so I'm glad it helps. So osteons, we said that was the arrangement that we saw in our compact bone, right? So compact bone, remember that's the only way that, or compact bone is the only kind of bone tissue that has osteons in it. Osteons, we did our word math, right, is this central canal, the blood vessel and then all of those concentric lamellae, all of the rings of cells around it. So osteons are how you recognize compact bone tissue. I know I bumped into one of my groups, and we didn't necessarily have an answer for this question here. I don't know if it's just because we didn't want to mark it or because we didn't quite understand it. Here's my first question to kind of go along with what Jacqueline was talking about. When we say extracellular matrix, here's my first question that I know we can answer for sure. What does extracellular mean? Extracellular? Yeah, so extracellular means that we're outside. So extracellular, that means we are outside. The question in the chat was, what does this matrix word mean? And that's actually a great question because it's part of what makes my tissues different from each other. So when I use this word matrix, I'm going to do some word math with you here. One of the first things that is in matrix, and it's what Jacqueline mentioned in her comment, is the proteins that we have. So part of the extracellular matrix, part of the stuff that's outside the cell, is the proteins that are on the outside. The other thing that's on the outside of the cell is something called ground substance. Ground substance. So this phrase right here, extracellular matrix, just think of matrix as the stuff, everything I have outside of my cells that live in these tissues. So here's a wink, wink, nudge, nudge for us. Every kind of connective tissue has extracellular matrix. I'll type that down for us because that's kind of a good big picture to know. Every kind of connective tissue has, and I'm going to abbreviate it as ECM, extracellular matrix, ECM. So put that in easy words then. Every kind of connective tissue has ground substance and proteins. Remind me again in the chat, which of these tissues that we're looking at over here is connective tissue? Which of these are connective tissues? Yeah, all of them, right? So this was kind of a way of asking the exact same question. Which ones have extracellular matrix? They all do. They all have specific kinds of cells, whether they're called osteocytes or whether they're called chondrocytes. And then they also have this stuff on the outside, this matrix stuff on the outside. Now, this would be a good time for us to actually compare bone tissue to cartilage tissue, because one of the biggest differences between them is what's going on in their matrix. So I'm going to delete a little arrow here to make a space. We are going to compare bone, so in general, compact bone or spongy bone, to hyaline cartilage. Abbreviate. When we talk about bone and hyaline cartilage, the thing that's different between them is the composition of their matrix, their stuff on the outside. So let's start with hyaline cartilage. I'm going to start with, here, we'll build this table that you have in your notes, ground substance. Start with the ground substance. In hyaline cartilage, the name of the ground substance, the stuff that's on the outside of my cells, is called chondroitin sulfate. I typed it for you because that's a really weird word, chondroitin sulfate. But hey, check this out. Chondro. Same question as earlier today. What does chondro mean? Chondro. Yeah, it still means the same thing. Every time I see chondro, it still always means cartilage. When you are learning the ground substance, when you're learning the stuff that makes up most of the outside of my hyaline cartilage tissue, the good news is you know that chondro means cartilage. So we know that this must be the ground substance in hyaline cartilage. Bone is not going to have chondroitin sulfate because this chondro part tells me it's only found in cartilage. So the ground substance, in our picture here, it's all of this light pink stuff that we see. All of that is chondroitin sulfate. That's what I call it. It's kind of like Jello. It's a little bit squishy. When I look at my types of bone connective tissue, whether it's the pink stuff I see here, or whether it's kind of the beige gray stuff that I see down here, the ground substance in bone connective tissue is calcium phosphate. Calcium phosphate. So the stuff that you see that's kind of beige, that's light or dark in these places where there's a lot of it, all the stuff that's inside these trabeculae, building the trabeculae, that's calcium phosphate. One of the reasons that this matters is when we start talking about the impact of hormones on your blood calcium level, we can change the amount of bone that we have in the body because we need that calcium. So if we're low on calcium, this is why we'll break down our bones to get calcium back, because we store calcium outside all of my bone cells. Or this is why if you have a ton of calcium in your diet, we'll use it to build more bones. So calcium phosphate, that's the name of the stuff, the ground substance is on the outside of my bone cells. Chondroitin sulfate is the name of the ground substance or the pink stuff that's on the outside of the cartilage cells. So Nicole's asking where we store calcium. Primarily the place we store it is in our bone tissue. Compact bone is going to be better for storing it, but I still have a bunch of calcium stored in my trabeculae too. So I still have it in a spongy bone as well. But usually if you're trying to store more calcium, what you're more likely to build is you're going to build some extra compact bone, just because all of this entire space is filled with this calcium stuff. Okay, so we've talked about half of extracellular matrix. We talked about the ground substance. The other thing that we said we had in extracellular matrix were proteins. So we'll make a list for ourselves here too, that the other thing that we're going to compare between bones and hyaline cartilage is the proteins. Now, for both of these types of tissue, we have the same protein. Both of these types of tissue have a protein that's known as collagen. Collagen. That is the same protein that we saw in dense regular connective tissue and dense irregular connective tissue. So collagen is my protein that I find all over the place inside my connective tissues. When I talk about comparing bone to hyaline cartilage in terms of the amount of collagen that they have, bone has a lot of collagen. It has a lot of collagen. Hyaline cartilage just has a little collagen. I guess I should have put that, a little collagen. When you're thinking about bone connective tissue, especially compact bone, I want you to think about it a lot kind of like a road. So when we make a road somewhere in the city, the first thing we do is we lay down that stuff called rebar, or those metal things that you see. Think of the metal things, the rebar that's inside the road, as my collagen. The job of collagen is to help my bone tissue be strong when it's getting like twisted or when it's getting pulled on. Collagen helps to make my bones resist breaking. So I put rebar in my roads for the same reason that I put collagen inside my bones, to help it resist breaking. But then on top of those metal bars that you put in the road, we also pour the concrete on top of them. Think about calcium phosphate like the concrete that goes on top. Calcium makes your bones really strong or really hard. Maybe that's a better way to describe it. The fact that your bones are so hard is because of the calcium. The fact that you can pull on them and twist them and they don't break, that's because of the collagen. as you are learning about the bone disorders, which is a big part of lesson number 8 is those bone disorders, keep in mind that some of our bone disorders are an issue with collagen, where either I don't make enough of it or the collagen that I make is not strong enough, or it's a problem with calcium, because calcium, when I have it in my diet, one of the primary places, one of the biggest things I'm doing with it is I'm building bone tissue. So if I don't have enough calcium in my bones, that's going to cause a couple of different disorders. If I've got an issue with the strength of my collagen because I made bad collagen, that's going to cause a disorder as well. So keep that bouncing in the back of your mind. We're not going to talk specifically about those disorders today. Maybe we'll talk some more about that tomorrow. But the biggest picture thing you want to get to as you're studying this bone disorders, is it an issue with the calcium in the bones, or is it an issue with the collagen in the bones? So keep that in mind. Before we move on, what questions do we have about the statements we did or about this stuff that we did with comparing our tissue types? Or shoot me an emoji if you're good. I'll send you my emoji as usual. A penguin. Nice. Halloween ghost. I like it. I went for a walk this morning with my daughter, and there's a house in my neighborhood that she loves to visit multiple times a day because they have witches that they've decorated their yard full of Halloween witches. So she really loves to go see. She always says, I want to go see the witches. So if you didn't know her or know us, you would think that she's really crazy. I want to go see the witches, but it's fun. Okay, let me look. I'll just mention I'm probably not going to take a lot of class time to do these kinds of compare and contrast because we kind of already did. In your notes, I walk you through the process of comparing hyaline cartilage to bone tissue in general, which is something that we already did, right? So remember, the biggest differences was in that ground substance and the amount of collagen. So the notes walk you through that again. But then later in the lesson, I also ask you to compare compact bone to spongy bone. And again, this is overlap with lab stuff. So the good news is you see it in the guided lesson, you've seen it in lab. It's really not anything new for you. We just have to remind ourselves of some of those things that we already talked about. Here's a question that students sometimes struggle with. When we talk about lacuna, what did we say in lab that this word lacuna meant? What does the word lacuna mean? Yeah, so a lacuna is a home. A lacuna is a home. A home is an open space. Oh, here we can tie this together now. A lacuna is one of the only places in connective tissue without extracellular matrix. Here we go. When you're looking at connective tissues, one of the only places in that tissue that you're not going to see your ground substance and your proteins are these lacuna, because these are the homes, or these are the open spaces for the cells to live. So when I look at my compact bone tissue, my lacuna are these dark spots. Remind me, when we're in compact bone tissue, what was the name of the cells that are in these lacuna? Who lives in these lacuna? Yeah, living inside my lacuna are my osteocyte cells. So my osteocyte cells live in these lacuna, these open spaces, these homes. The homes are arranged, here's a lab word, in lamellae, in those lines. We line them up. And I know I saw a note in my chat about osteons. So when I take their blood supply, the central canal, and I put all of those circles of lacuna, all of those homes around it, then I build an osteon. So an osteon includes all of my lacuna, all of my lamellae, all of my lines. When I come over here to my spongy bone, I've still got my little bone cells. My little bone cells still need a place to live that doesn't have calcium phosphate in it and doesn't have collagen in it. The name of the homes that my bone cells live in spongy bone is also lacuna. My homes for bone cells called lacuna. Hey, check this out. My homes for cartilage cells also called lacuna. So that's why I mentioned to you that thinking about lacuna as a place where there's not extracellular matrix, that's going to help you as we're comparing our types of tissue. Hyaline cartilage has lacuna. It has special spaces for cartilage cells to live where there's no chondroitin sulfate and where there's no collagen. Just like in bone tissue, I have lacuna, which are places where there's no calcium phosphate and no collagen. So lacuna, these homes, found in all three of these tissues that I talked about. All of these cells need a special space to live, and that space that they live in is called lacuna. How do we feel about that? Yeah, okay, so I see the note in the chat, lacuna versus lacunae. Yep, yeah, so they do mean the same thing. So here, a lacuna is when I have one home. Lacunae is when there's more than one. 2+ homes. Gotta love, this is probably, I'm gonna say Latin. In Latin, we make something plural by adding an E to it. So the word lacuna is one of them. Lacunae is when there's more than one of them. Yeah. Okay, question in the chat is if spongy bone has lacuna or not. I'm gonna put that to the class. What do we think? Spongy bone, we have lacuna here? Yeah, we actually do. Yep. Remember we were saying that lacuna is just a home. It's just an open space where there's not, in this case, calcium and collagen. My bone cells need their space. They gotta have a home, and that home is a lacuna. Yeah, so look at that. We learned something today. If we learned nothing else, we learned that spongy bone also has lacuna in it. Spongy bone, compact bone, cartilage. All of those guys have got lacuna. Yep, hyaline cartilage has it too. Any other questions? What else were we thinking? Mind blown. Yep. I like to blow your mind. Okay, well, let's switch gears then. If we don't have other questions. Oh, Jesse has a question. Go for it, Jesse. Yeah, if you want to turn your mic on, Jesse, you can. Unless it's an accident, that's totally fine. That's okay. Okay, let's switch gears then. We've talked about comparing compact bone to spongy bone. We've talked about comparing cartilage to bone tissue. Let's talk now about the process of turning cartilage into bone. So here's the name of the process of turning cartilage into bone. We call it endochondral ossification. endochondral ossification. Let's start with some stuff that I know that you guys can help me define. This chondral part right here. What did we say that chondro means? Still means the same thing. What does chondro always mean? Yep, chondro always means cartilage. Absolutely. Okay. When I see this end part right here, this ossification part, when we see os or when we see osteo, what does that always refer to? What's osteo? Yeah, osteo is bone. Absolutely. Bone. Okay, so the name of this process we're talking about is endochondral ossification. Ossification, this big long word right here. Think about the entire word, ossification, as meaning bone building. Bone building, ossification, the process of building bone. When I talk about endochondral ossification, this beginning part right here, endo, means on the inside. So I'll add that one for us here. Inside. Endochondral ossification. Inside cartilage, bone building. When you see this big long name, I want you to interpret it or change it into easy words. Inside cartilage, bone building. Endochondral ossification. Remember that the fetal skeleton, all of the bones in your body start as hyaline cartilage. So we need to turn this hyaline cartilage into bone. Bone tissue is going to be way stronger. Bone tissue is going to allow me to attach muscles so that I can do movements. Endochondral ossification, how I take the fetal skeleton and turn it into bones. So the way this process works, we start with a cartilage model. So the fetal skeleton made entirely out of a cartilage model. As that cartilage model gets a little bit bigger, as a fetus is developing, the first thing that's going to happen to that fetus on its hyaline models is it's going to build something called a bone collar. So a bone collar is a little stretch of bone that we see all the way around this central part of the bone. It wraps around it entirely, a thin layer of bone. Okay, let's do a lab correlation here. This middle part of my bone, called the shaft of the bone, what was my lab word for the shaft of the bone? What's this region of the bone called? The shaft of the bone. Yeah, nice. We're able to spell it, even though it's a weird word, right? Okay, so the shaft of the bone is called the diaphysis. That's this middle portion here of the bone. So what happens is I build a cartilage model. We'll say that we're building the humerus, for example. So I build a little model out of hyaline cartilage of the humerus. And as that cartilage model gets bigger, it receives messages from its environment that it should start to build bone tissue on the outside, on the diaphysis. So it builds this thing called a bone collar. Now the bone collar is great for being bone tissue, but bone tissue is not great at letting blood through to get from one side to the other. So I've got this cartilage model, but on the inside is not receiving any blood. When we talk about blood, we've always said there's two things that blood has that cells need. What are the two things that blood has that cells need to survive? Exactly. Yep. First thing that all my cells need, they got to have oxygen. We need that air to breathe. Our cells got to breathe. And the second thing that they need is their food, their nutrients. So we're totally right. Glucose, cell's favorite food. When I put this bone collar on the outside of my bone, Essentially, the middle, or outside of my bone model, the middle of this cartilage here is now suddenly cut off from oxygen and nutrients. So when I cut off the middle of this model from oxygen and nutrients, I form this area in the middle of we call it calcified matrix. I've taken the hyaline cartilage. It's starting to die. It's grabbing at calcium because it's got no food and no oxygen. It can't do anything else. The middle part of this model starts to die. It starts to calcify. Now, as these chondrocytes are sending out their SOS message, we're dying, we're starving to death, what happens is a blood vessel will go through the bone collar and go into the middle of the model. But it's kind of like too little, too late. The blood vessel gets into the center of my model here, into the diaphysis, and it brings with it oxygen and nutrients. But it also brings with it a special type of cells called osteoblasts. Osteoblasts. My friends who've had a chance to look at this lesson, what do osteoblasts do? What's their job? Yeah, absolutely right. Osteoblasts are bone builders. Osteoblasts are bone builders. Anytime you see blast, that means it's a builder. So I bring in a blood vessel into the diaphysis, into the shaft of my bone. With it comes oxygen, with it comes nutrients, and most importantly comes osteoblasts, my bone builders. So I bring in my blood vessel, I bring in my bone builders, and I build this thing called the primary ossification center. So the primary ossification center is the first place that I'm building good, strong bone tissue. The first place I build good, strong bone tissue, the primary ossification center in the diaphysis or the shaft of the bone. Now, as I bring in my initial blood vessels, I start to make a little bit of bone tissue here in the middle, but the longer that blood supply comes into the bone, the more I start to build good, strong bone tissue. So from here to here, I've really filled in all of my cartilage that I still see in my step right here. I've turned all of it into bone. So there'd be spongy bone more toward the middle, and I build strong, compact bone on the outside. All of this is happening around that primary ossification center, the first place that I build my bone, and that's in the diaphysis, in the shaft. When we get closer to the time of birth, when a baby is born, we're going to form things called secondary ossification centers. When I make a secondary ossification center, I'm building that in the end of the bone. What was our lab word for the end of a bone? I'll remind us here that shaft was the diaphysis. Yeah, the ends of my bone was the E word, epiphysis. Okay, so my secondary ossification centers, actually have two of them in every long bone, they form in those epiphyses, in the ends. Again, it's because I bring in some blood vessels. Those blood vessels bring with them oxygen and nutrients and osteoblasts, our bone builders. So around the time of birth, we start to fill in the bone tissue in the ends, in the epiphyses of the bones. As we transition into childhood and adolescence, what ends up happening is I make bone tissue everywhere except for, here's a couple of places, we'll circle them, except for something called the articular cartilage and something called epiphyseal plate. When I talk about the articular cartilage, how might you describe where this is found? Do we know what this articular word means? Any ideas? Do we know what an articulation is? Does that help us at all? articulation. Yeah, so it's present on long bones. At the end of long bones form articulations, which is a fancy word for joints. Articulations, a fancy word for joints, where more than one bone comes together. So remember how we were talking before about how at the end of each of your phalanges, you have some of that hyaline cartilage. So that hyaline cartilage at the end of each of your phalanges is called the articular cartilage. So articular cartilage is the type of cartilage that I find inside articulations, or that I find inside the joints of your body. So we started with a cartilage model. Everything was cartilage. By the time your bones are done doing this process, I'll type its name again to remind us, endochondral ossification. By the time we're done doing endochondral ossification, I took all of that cartilage model, turned it into bone tissue, except for the articular cartilage, which is the cartilage at the ends of my bones, and except for a thing called the epiphyseal plate. That's this little line of cartilage that I see right here. That sticks around for quite a while as well. For my friends who've done this lesson, what's the easy person name for what the epiphyseal plate is? Does anyone remember? What else could we call the epiphyseal plate? Yeah, we can also call the epiphyseal plate the growth plate. Growth plate. And we'll talk about how I use it to grow. But the big idea here, the two places cartilage doesn't leave, two places we're going to keep it around, is epiphyseal plate that we see right here, and the articular cartilage that we see here forming those joints. Help me out in the chat. What questions do we still have about the process of endochondral ossification? Tierney says she's good. I'm throwing you a bone. I have to crack that joke. Yeah, Christina's got a question. Go for it.
It's just easier for me to say it out loud than typing it.
That's totally fine.
So endochondral ossification. I understand that the hyaline cartilage model develops first. So when you move on to the chondrocytes inside the model to calcify, does the bone color develop at the same time? Like it's all simultaneously happening, or is it like, does it take the time? I guess I'm not sure how to ask it.
Yeah, no, so I think I know what you're asking about. Let me go back to my picture here. The way we're going to learn it is that the bone color develops first. We're getting messages from around our hyaline cartilage model that tell it, hey, you get to become bone. So the outside of the hyaline cartilage builds this bone tissue. That bone tissue essentially starves my chondrocytes that live in the middle. And when they're starving, when they're dying, they go through a process called calcification, where they basically form like really bad bone tissue. It's not strong at all, but it's a lot like bone. So that's what it means when it's saying calcifying. Basically, think of them as grabbing at any calcium they can get their hands on. They're going to pretend to be bone tissue, but they're not good at it. So the bone collar builds on the outside of my model. That's going to starve the inside of nutrients and oxygen, causing it to calcify. So it happens a little bit later than the bone collar forming. Any other questions that we have about this process? And maybe you guys can confirm for me. I think there's a video in the guided lesson that shows this, right? Am I remembering correctly? There's a video about this. Okay, Tierney is saying yes. Yeah, so check that out. There's also an article about it. Yes, yes. So multiple different resources. If this is something that is a little bit more challenging for you, which it totally is every semester, so don't feel bad if you feel like this is a little more challenging to wrap your mind around. Check out that video, check out that article, and when in doubt, you can always do a YouTube search too, and just watch videos that you can find out there. So this was the process of endochondral ossification, inside cartilage bone building. I know we had a request at the beginning of class today that we talk about x-rays. And the reason we're going to talk about x-rays is in the context of these epiphyseal plates that we just mentioned. So remember that the epiphyseal plate, or the growth plate, is one of the places where bone tissue is left behind after we do endochondral ossification, after we build bone tissue from cartilage. When we look at a person's x-rays, we can actually see their growth plate. So here, let's do a little review. I'm going to be mean and make you type some tough stuff here. When we talked about bone extracellular matrix and we compared that to cartilage extracellular matrix, does anyone remember the name of that special stuff in cartilage? What was the name of the pink stuff in cartilage? Yeah, so cartilage has a little bit of collagen. We do have a little collagen. Got a ton of collagen in bones, lots of collagen. It's the weird one, right? I was really mean to make you guys type that. Hey, if I can type it, you guys can type it too, right? So the name of it, chondroitin sulfate. Okay, when I talk about bone, just give me the first word. What's that ground substance in bone? What does bone have a ton of on the outside? Yeah, bone is stored as calcium. Calcium, technically calcium phosphate. Here we go. When we look at an X-ray, which is a way for us to see things, when we shine X-rays on calcium phosphate and collagen, the X-rays bounce back, especially because of this calcium here. The X-rays bounce back at us. So when you're looking at an X-ray, we're actually looking at the knee joint here. So when I look at the X-ray of a knee joint here, all the parts of the bone that I can see everywhere, that's because those X-rays bounced back at me. They didn't go through the structure. If I'm looking at a bone, though, that has what looks like kind of floating spaces inside of it, what's happening is I'm sending my X-rays at these bones, and some of the parts, you can see them very clearly. That's the places where I've got that calcium in the extracellular matrix. But some of the places have extracellular matrix that's made out of chondroitin sulfate. That was that pink squishy stuff that we saw in hyaline cartilage. That pink squishy stuff that we see in hyaline cartilage lets X-rays pass straight through. So if the X-rays pass straight through, then we just see this floating space. We see an empty space where I have cartilage instead of bone tissue. So when I'm looking at an X-ray, and like I said, we're looking at the knee here, notice that I can see in all of my long bones. So remember from lab, we classified bones by their structure. All of my long bones will have growth plates. So long bones have epiphyseal plates. All of them have epiphyseal plates, at least until we're done growing. You would see those epiphyseal plates as a floating space in between the parts of the bones. That's because I've got chondroitin sulfate there, because I have hyaline cartilage connective tissue as opposed to calcium phosphate. See, if I look over here at this version of the knee, I tried to highlight for you. It's really hard to see, but you can kind of see that there's a little bit of a white line right here. When I'm done growing, I actually turn my growth plate, I turn that cartilage into bone tissue. So sometimes you can kind of see a line where I closed it off, but a lot of times, like it's really hard to see here, you can't really see it. But the way that I know that this is an X-ray that doesn't have a growth plate is because I don't see the floating things. See how we can definitely see that these bones are disconnected. So we're definitely disconnected over here versus we're totally connected over here. That means I don't have cartilage tissue anymore in this one over here. By the way, I should have had us do this earlier. We are looking at the knee joint right here. Let's try to name some of our bones in the knee joint. So this bone that's coming down from the top, what's the name of the bone that comes down from the top? Yeah, so my one up here is the femur. We do see the femur. What is the name of the T-shaped bone, the wide one down below it? What's that one? Yeah, that one is the tibia, the T-bone, tibia. And then my little tiny friend over here, who's this guy? Yep, there's the little fibula over there. Let's see if that'll show up. Fibula. I know it's a little hard to see. I'm going to circle here with a light color thing. You can kind of see the outline of the kneecap. You guys see that? You can kind of see the outline of the kneecap up here. What's the name of the kneecap again? What's your kneecap called? Yeah, kneecap is the patella. Patella. So we can kind of see the patella there as well in the knee joint. Jessie's saying her daughter broke her tibia. Yikes, that's a bad one. Fibula is much smaller. That would be much easier to repair. The tibia would be a lot harder to repair. So I'm sure that was painful and a long recovery. Yeah, it was awful, I'm sure. Yeah. So we said this before. Remind me again that the easy person name for epiphyseal plate. What was the other thing we could call the epiphyseal plate? What was the other thing that we might call that? Yeah, the other thing we can call it, oh, let's not type in yellow here. The other thing we can call it is the growth plate. Growth plate. Here's why I mentioned that. Because if you look at an X-ray and you see the epiphyseal plate, we see this open space here, that tells us that our patient is still growing. As long as you have cartilage in this epiphyseal plate place, you are still making your bones grow longer because the epiphyseal plate is made out of cartilage. Cartilage allows your bones to grow longer. So as long as your X-ray that you're looking at shows the growth plate, as long as we've got these floating bones, is what I kind of like to call them, that patient is still growing. As we get older, the epiphyseal plate turns into something else. What's the name of what the epiphyseal plate becomes? What does the epiphyseal plate turn into when you get older? Does anyone happen to remember? Yeah, the epiphyseal plate turns into the epiphyseal line. So the epiphyseal line, I'm going to delete my patella here. The epiphyseal line is what we can kind of see right here. It's just what happens when I turn all of that cartilage in my growth plate, when I turn it all into bone tissue, then what I would call it is the epiphyseal line. This, by the way, would be underline, highlight, star terminology. I'm going to put a box around it. The difference between the epiphyseal plate and the epiphyseal line, 100%, make sure we know what each of these things are. The epiphyseal plate is made out of cartilage. It's cartilage tissue that I use to make my bones longer. The epiphyseal line is bone tissue. If I see this bone tissue, my bones are done growing. We have hit our point. That is as tall as we're going to get. For my friends who've worked through this activity, help me out. Approximately what age does the epiphyseal plate turn into an epiphyseal line? when do we typically stop growing? Yeah, so it's kind of a range. It's a little bit different for boys versus girls. Generally speaking, it's in the age range of about 18 to 20, 18 to 21 year. I'm going to type here, years old, plate becomes a line. For girls, it's typically going to be closer to that teen years old. For boys, it's typically going to be closer to the 21 years old. It's kind of a range that we typically see the plate becoming a line in. That's important for you because when we're thinking about all the kinds of information that an X-ray can tell us about a patient, first thing it can tell us is whether or not that patient is still growing. If I still have a growth plate, my patient is still growing. If I don't have a growth plate anymore, my patient is done growing. But the second kind of information that I can get from an X-ray about my patient is their general age. If I see a growth plate, my patient is probably going to be younger than 18 to 21. If I don't see a growth plate anymore, my patient is probably older than this 18 to 21 range. So keep that in mind as we're looking at X-rays. If I see a growth plate, not only do I know you're still growing, I also know that you're young. If I don't see a growth plate, you're done growing, and you're also probably a little bit older. So you have a practice X-ray in the lesson. When we look at this practice X-ray here, what are some of the things that you guys notice? What do we see here? Yeah, so we're definitely seeing that growth plate, right? I was kind to you on this image here. I put a little marker to show you. We see this floating bones appearance, right? So there's a space in between the bone tissue that tells me that this bone still has that growth plate there. And if I still have that growth plate, I am or am not going to get taller. I still have a growth plate. Yeah, I am going to get taller. Absolutely, going to keep getting taller. The other thing that I could say is, do you have an idea of how old that I might be? If this is what my X-ray looks like, what would we say? I would say I'm someone younger, right? Someone probably under the age of 18. Absolutely. And if I'm asking you, I'll mention, I can't remember if I put all of these options in the guided lesson for you or not. I'm never going to be tricky and give you an X-ray like this and have an answer option that says, this patient is 18 or this patient is 19. I'm going to be really obvious with you. So someone put in the chat like 14. That would be an option I could put on there. Or I might put an option of 40 on there. So I'm not going to give you a number that's right in the range. Know that if you have a growth plate, you're younger than 18. Know that if you don't, you're probably older than 21. There's some variability because, yeah, someone was mentioning in the chat her daughter having an epiphyseal line when she was younger. It varies from person to person. That's why some people grow really tall and why some people don't grow quite as tall. Whenever your epiphyseal plate closes, you're done growing. So if it closes earlier, you're not going to be taller anymore. I always had this dream in like middle school and high school. Is like, I'm going to hit 6 foot, like I'm going to get there. And then I stopped growing at like 5'7". So I've mentioned this before. I'm the youngest of 4 kids. I have 3 brothers, and they are all officially taller than me, including my brother who's like 13 years younger than me. He is now taller than me. So I'm the shortest one in the family, but I'm also the only girl. So there you go. Jacqueline asked if we have a picture of, I don't have the thumb X-ray with me, but what I am doing, let me pull up. I'm going to show you guys really fast. Let me share my screen with you. One of the best ways to study this stuff for the upcoming exam is to do a Google image search. So if we do a Google image search, I did a Google image search for epiphyseal plate X-ray. Now it's going through and it's showing me all kinds of X-rays. Look at how awesome this one is. You can really see that growth plate there. So see it there, and here's my thumb side. So this one over here, what's the name of the one that's on the thumb side again? Who's this that lives on that thumb side? Yeah, the radius lives on the thumb side. So check out that awesome growth plate in the radius. And my little ulna over here, we can see the growth plate in there. So I can see the growth plate on this one. Here's that image that we looked at before. I can see the growth plate in the femur and the tibia and the fibula. It's possible that this might be the image you're referencing, Jacqueline. I don't remember for sure because it's been a while since I made those. Yeah, so I don't know if I can make it any bigger, but we'd want to look and see the bones of the hands are long bones too. And actually, I'll say I probably used, oops. Ooh, here we go. Let's do it, right? Join the Bone Science newsletter. Sounds fun for me. I'm a teacher, right? So fun for me. You're all like, what? You can actually see one of these hands has an epiphyseal plate and one of these hands does not. Can we tell from looking which one has the epiphyseal plates? Any ideas? Yeah, the left one, I should scroll down, sorry. The left one has those epiphyseal plates. Notice here in particular, check this out. This sweet line that I'm seeing right here in these bones. These are the bones in the fingers. What was the name of the finger bones again? What's the name of finger bones? Yeah, the phalanges, right? So you can see this little floating part of the phalanx that's going to turn into what we see here. Right now, we're still seeing this little floating space in between. We're going to see it really clearly right here. We're seeing that floating space. We can see it right here as well. What's the name of the bones that are in the palms of your hand? What are the palms of the hand bones called? Do we remember? Yeah, these ones are the metacarpals. So I can see that little floating bone piece in the metacarpals. For that matter, I can even see it down here in my radius too, right? So compare these floating bones that I see here to these fully intact bones. This is what an epiphyseal, we'd say an epiphyseal line would look like because we don't see those floating bones. What we do see though, check this out. We got a little sesamoid bone going on over here. With sesamoid bones, where did I find them again? Does anyone remember how we classified sesamoid bones? Yeah, sesamoid bones were the type of bones that were found not embedded in cartilage, but actually embedded inside your tendons. Yeah, so I joked that a person could form it from playing video games. This is there in the thumb. When you use a joint or you move a tendon a lot, it can form a little bone inside of it. So here's a little sesamoid bone from this person using their thumb a whole lot. They've got a little extra bone floating around in there. So we got onto that image again because I did a Google search, Google Images search here, epiphyseal plate X-ray. You could also do a search for epiphyseal line X-ray. I think I told you this in your guided lesson, but you do need to be prepared to see a picture like this and tell me, is there an epiphyseal plate? Is there an epiphyseal line? How old might this patient be? Are they still growing? Are they not still growing? So the more you can go through and just look at the pictures that you see here in Google, the more you'll get used to it. We're really just looking for that floating. We're really just looking for spaces inside that bone. If I've got spaces like I see right here, that's going to be an epiphyseal plate. If I don't have spaces like I see here, this is solid bone on every part, then that's going to be considered an epiphyseal line. Yeah, I like it. Jacqueline's determined. We got it, for sure. Yeah, so just do some practice. I love Google Images. I stare at pictures all the time, so none of this all the time. A fun fact, I have an oven mitt. I should bring it to class tomorrow since my kitchen is like, 10 feet away. I have an oven mitt that I bought at a science teachers convention because I'm a nerd like that. And I didn't notice until like a year ago that the oven mitt, which by the way has a hand, that's why I went back to the pictures here, has a hand on it. I didn't notice until very recently that oven mitt was of an X-ray of a child, probably. How do I know that it's a child X-ray? How might I know that? Yeah, it has a growth plate. So I will try to remember to bring that oven mitt tomorrow to show you guys on the camera because I'm a nerd like that. I've got a child's X-ray oven mitt that I use. So it has growth plates. And I can tell that it's a young person because of those growth plates. How do we feel about the X-rays now? We're feeling a little bit better about them. Awesome. Nicole's dancing. She's like, we got this. Good. Okay. So let's see. So let's switch gears a little bit then, because I know that something that we wanted to talk about was hormones. To help us understand hormones, we need to talk a little bit about bone cells first. So we'll talk about bone cells, and then we're going to kind of talk about the activity of the cells. We might be able to touch a little bit on hormones today. I think we'll probably do more with the hormones tomorrow. So we'll plan to do hormones tomorrow, and remember, we are trying to work ahead on that skeletal system disorders activity so that we have some specific questions for tomorrow, so I know what to cover with you guys. My spacing got funky when I uploaded this. So here's my osteocyte over here. Here's my osteoblast, or my typo too. Let's just erase this and we'll start over. Here we go. Cross it all off. These guys are a mess. Okay. We've got our osteoclast up here, and we've got our osteocyte over here. Okay, so 3 types of bone cells. Yeah, so to the question in the chat, yeah, endochondral ossification, that's what we use to take the fetal skeleton into the skeleton that a baby has. It's involved a little bit as well in the process shortly after a baby's born to finish ossifying those epiphyses in general. But most of what we do in terms of growth is because of the growth plate, and that's not endochondral ossification. So very true, like Jacqueline said, endochondral ossification happens way before puberty. It's the growth plate that makes your bones keep growing as you're in puberty, a little bit younger. Okay, 3 types of bone cells that we have in the body. We've got osteoblasts, we've got osteoclasts, we've got osteocytes. I promise you, by the way, that I'm not going to make you identify these cells based on their shape. So don't worry about that kind of stuff. So just a heads up. We have already talked today about osteoblasts. Remind me what osteoblasts do. What's their job again? Yeah, osteoblasts are my bone builders. Bone builders. My bone builders, specifically the way that they work to build bone tissue, is they build the protein that we said acted kind of like rebar inside our bones. What was the name of the protein that your bones have a lot of in their extracellular matrix? What's that protein called? Osteoblasts build collagen. Absolutely. They build collagen. They build this protein, they put it down, and when they build this collagen, when they build a couple of other proteins that go along with it, that's going to cause calcium to attach. So osteoblasts build collagen, and then calcium that's floating around in the bloodstream attaches to that collagen. So the way that osteoblasts build bone tissue, they lay down protein. Those proteins attract the calcium that's in your bloodstream to attach to it. And now I've built my extracellular matrix made out of calcium and made out of collagen. Osteoblasts are really great at doing their job at building proteins that calcium wants to attach to. They're so great at doing it, though, that osteoblasts end up completely surrounded by collagen and calcium. And when that happens, an osteoblast turns into an osteocyte. Does anyone happen to remember from the guided lesson? What did I tell you to kind of think about with osteocytes? What did I call osteocytes? Anyone remember? Yeah, so I like to think of osteocytes as the retired bone cells. Retired bone cells. See, the way an osteocyte develops, the way that it forms, is an osteoblast worked so hard for so long that it's completely surrounded by calcium and collagen. When it gets completely surrounded by calcium and collagen, it retires. It can't keep making proteins because there's no space to put them down. So osteocytes are retired bone cells, and much like a lot of normal retired people, all that osteocytes really do is they kind of stay in their home and they take care of it. They keep it clean, they keep it tidy. That's what they're there for. Who remembers the name of the home that osteocytes live inside of? What's the home for osteocytes? Yeah. So osteocytes live in their lacuna. Or maybe I should put osteocytes stay in their lacuna. Let's phrase it that way. So osteocytes, they just stay inside that lacuna. They take care of it. They keep it strong and tidy. When you are an osteocyte, you are at the stage in the circle of life where you're done. You've done your job, you've built your bone, now we just gotta keep our little home safe. That's my osteocytes. Osteoblasts are the up-and-comers. They're building new bone tissue. They're making your bones larger, stronger, etc. That's the osteoblast. Who can tell me what osteoclasts do? What's the job of an osteoclast? Yeah, osteoclasts are my bone breakers. So when you see that ending part clast always means we're breaking something down. So my osteoclasts are a type of bone cells. They're my bone breakers. Or I like that Jesse put it more technically for us. When I break down bone tissue, what I call that is the process of resorption. So one of the things you're going to read about in the lesson is doing bone resorption. So osteoclasts, their job is to break down bone tissue, or it's called resorb bone tissue. The way that this works is osteoclasts spit out, so they use their little tails down here to spit out enzymes, so to spit out proteins that will break down bone tissue, that will dissolve the calcium that's in the bone tissue, or that will break down the collagen that's in the bone tissue. Osteoclasts are really important in the process of remodeling your bones, so taking what's there and making it stronger. They're also really involved in balancing the amount of calcium in your bloodstream. If I don't have enough calcium in my bloodstream, I need my osteoclast to resorb or break down some of that bone so that the calcium that was inside of it gets released into the bloodstream. So 3 types of bone cells in the body. Osteoblasts, my bone builders, they build the proteins, the calcium comes to the proteins. Osteocytes, the cells that are retired because they've built so much bone tissue around them that there's not space to build anything else, they can retire. And osteoclasts, my bone cells that break down bone tissue that I already have. In normal situations, normally what's happening is the rate that my bone breakers work, my osteoclasts, the rate that they're breaking stuff down is the same as the rate that I'm building new things. So here's that word that we put on the other slide. Bone resorption, the process of breaking bone down, normally is the same as the rate of bone formation. Bone formation or bone building is what osteoblasts do. Bone resorption or bone breaking is what osteoclasts do. Now, this is what's happening in you and me, in normal adults. The rate that I build bone and break it is the same. When we talk about kids who are growing, what do you think we might be able to say about the rates of activity in kids? Is it the same? Is it different? When you're growing, when you're growing, I need bone formation to happen more quickly than the process of bone formation. I'm trying to build new bone. So when we're going in the process of growing taller, or as our bones are getting stronger, they're getting bigger, we would say that bone formation happens more quickly than bone resorption. Yeah, Christina's absolutely right. There's two things that happen in bone formation. So in the bone formation or the work of osteoblasts, it does two things for me. First thing it does is it makes me taller. That's the first thing that forming new bone does. But the second thing that forming new bone does is it increases bone density. Increases bone density. Bone density is just a fancy way for saying how much collagen and calcium you have. Your bone density is how much collagen and calcium is chilling out in the extracellular matrix of your bones. So when I'm doing bone formation, I'm getting more bone tissue made, I'm growing taller, but I'm also increasing how much bone is there. I'm adding an extra layer of bone tissue on the outside. So my bone density goes up, my length of my bones is going up. This is thanks to my osteoblasts, my bone builders. So during childhood, during adolescence, activity of my osteoblasts is greater than the activity of my osteoclasts. As I reach adulthood, I no longer need my osteoblasts to work faster than my osteoclasts. They get about equal, about normal, that we're at the same, working at the same rate. It's possible, and what we see in the bone disorder osteoporosis, it's possible for the rate that my osteoclasts are working at to be higher than the rate that my osteoblasts are working at. When my bone breakers work harder and faster than my bone builders, I can start to have some issues with bone density, like Christina was mentioning, bone density. So when my osteoclasts work faster than my osteoblasts, my bone density decreases. The amount of stuff that I have outside my cells goes down. There were two things that I had outside of my cells in bone tissue. Remind me again, what are the two things that I have outside my cells in bone tissue? What's in that extracellular matrix? What's out there? Yeah, so I've got a whole lot of calcium, right? And I've got my collagen as well. If my bone density decreases, I have less calcium outside of my bone tissue. Calcium was what made my bone tissue hard, what made it stable. I also probably have less collagen. Collagen is something, or maybe it's not even less collagen. Let's say we're going to change it to, I'm going to call it exposed collagen. I've got my collagen, but it's not covered up in calcium like it's supposed to be. But when my osteoclasts spit out enzymes, mostly what those enzymes do is they free up the calcium. We're basically melting the concrete in the road. So I melt the concrete in the road, I leave the rebar, those metal bars, alone. But if they don't have any calcium on top of them, they can't really do anything to help me, to prevent my bones from fracturing. So here's a wink, wink, nudge, nudge as you're thinking toward the skeletal system disorders. The disorder of osteoporosis, literally, by the way, osteoporosis means bones with holes. Osteoporosis, a pore is a hole. So osteoporosis happens when my osteoclasts, my bone breakers, work faster than my osteoblasts, my bone builders. What's happening is my bone is losing its calcium. I'm losing my calcium. It's going back into the bloodstream because my osteoclasts are working faster than my osteoblasts are. What questions do we have at this point? Yeah, go for it, Jesse.
So what would happen if you have too much calcium in your bloodstream?
Would use as much of the calcium as it can to build bone tissue. But probably what would end up happening if you have just an extreme excess of calcium, honestly, we would probably just pee it out. Because it would be suspended in our blood. We'd send it to the kidneys. The kidneys would be like, what in the world is all this extra calcium? So we would try to eliminate some of it. Any of it that we can't put down in our bone tissue, we would probably just eliminate it in urine. It could give us some issues though. In next unit, we're going to talk about how we use calcium in the process of muscle signaling, getting muscles to contract, and then helping our neurons to talk to each other. So we could potentially, I could see there maybe being some issues too though with your muscular system and your nervous system, because they both rely on calcium not being like excessively high. So Jacqueline's question is, so low calcium is bad, which is why osteoclasts start to work more. Yeah, so I probably don't have enough time today to completely explore homeostasis with you, but in general, we always want anything that happens with homeostasis, we always want to keep it stable. So if I do go too low, if I don't have the right amount of calcium in my bloodstream, that is problematic. If I don't have enough calcium, it's going to be hard for me to tell my muscle cells to contract. It's going to be hard for my neurons to talk to each other. So I do need to make sure that I have enough calcium in the bloodstream, which is why if it gets too low, my body is willing to sacrifice some of what it's stored in the bone tissue to get that calcium level up to what it needs to be. So yes, having low calcium would be bad. Just like having low oxygen would be bad, just like having low glucose would be bad. It's one of those things that we keep in balance in the body on purpose. Let's see, I have 9 minutes. I guess here's what we'll do. We'll try to talk through this fast today, and we'll bring our questions about this tomorrow. How does that sound? Give a quick crash course in calcium homeostasis. Okay, so let's do our crash course, and then we'll talk about this more tomorrow. What Jacqueline mentioned and asked was whether or not it's bad for us to have a low calcium level. It's bad for us to have low calcium, and it's bad for us to have high calcium. We want to keep things balanced in the body. Now, let me remind you, I will not ask you to memorize this number. So please don't waste any mental energy memorizing that it's 9 to 11 milligrams per 100 mils. I'm not going to ask you that. What I will ask you to know is what happens when we get below these numbers or when we get above these numbers. So this is another example of homeostasis. The first example of homeostasis that we talked about in the last unit was when we were talking about body temperature. So homeostasis is, maybe in easy words, something the body keeps stable. Something the body keeps stable. The amount of calcium we have in the blood, we want to keep that about stable. Let's say, for some reason, we don't have enough calcium anymore. So let's say that your diet is really low in calcium, or as you're going to read about with the disorder of rickets, let's say that you don't have enough vitamin D to absorb the calcium in your diet. For whatever reason, there's not enough calcium in my blood. My body says, this is not good. I need to have calcium. I got to have this. So what happens is that message that I don't have enough calcium in the blood is received by a type of endocrine organs called the parathyroid glands. The parathyroid glands. Okay, let's do a lab reminder here. When I talk about endocrine organs, what do endocrine organs do? What's their general job? Yeah, anytime you hear endocrine, it's all about hormones, all about hormones. So my parathyroid glands are an endocrine organ, which means the way they're going to respond if something is wrong is they're going to spit out a hormone. So calcium levels are low in the body. My parathyroid glands detect that, or they get that message. They're going to spit out a hormone called parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone spits out into the bloodstream. It's traveling throughout the body, and it meets up with, or it attaches to receptors on osteoclasts. What was the job of osteoclast cells? What do osteoclasts do? Exactly. Osteoclasts are my bone breakers. When osteoclasts hear this message of parathyroid hormone, the message they hear is, we need you to get more active. We need you to break down some bone tissue. Yeah, or like Tierney mentioned, we need you to do resorption because bone has a whole bunch of calcium stored in it, and I need that calcium not stored in my bone for later use. I need it right now. So osteoclasts get this message, parathyroid hormone. It attaches to the receptors on their surface. In a way, it kind of activates them. It causes them to kick into gear. They're going to go through, break down some bone tissue, and bring the calcium back up. So Nicole asked a great question. She asked if the parathyroid gland is the control center of this homeostasis loop. Remind me in the chat, what's the job of the control center in a homeostasis loop? What do control centers do? What's their job? So control centers, they process a message, or yeah, I would say the most important thing when we're trying to identify what the control center is its job is to control the effectors, or basically make stuff happen. Let's put it in the most plain ways. Make stuff happen. So in this homeostasis loop, when we're talking about calcium levels, what's going to make something happen, my calcium is too low, is the parathyroid gland. Technically speaking, I believe there are other parts of the brain that do more of the processing of the calcium levels. But when we're thinking about a control center in the sense that it's helping to make stuff happen, it's deciding what's going to happen, sending out the message for what should happen. Yes, we would call the parathyroid glands that. So the parathyroid glands spit out parathyroid hormone. This hormone message goes to the osteoclasts. The osteoclasts say, we've been summoned into action, break down some bone tissue, get the calcium back up. Now, if the calcium levels are already too high in the body, I am not going to tell the bone cells to break down more bone tissue. That's not going to make my calcium levels get any lower. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to tell my bone cells that break down bone tissue to hold their horses. I'm going to say, I got plenty of calcium in the blood. Don't take any of the calcium out of my bone tissue anymore. So when I have too much blood calcium, we're going to work a little bit backwards here. I'm going to tell my osteoclasts, message I'm going to send them is to stop breaking down bone. When my calcium levels are too high, I send a message that tells my osteoclasts to stop working. What is the name of the hormone message that I use to tell my osteoclasts to stop working? What was that hormone called? Does anyone know? Yeah, the hormone that I send is called calcitonin. Calcitonin. The hormone calcitonin. When osteoclasts get this message, they hear it's time for them to go on break. It's time for them to stop working. No more breaking down bone because I got this message calcitonin. Remember, when I get the message parathyroid hormone, I say it's time for me to kick into gear. I got to break down some bone tissue. But if the message I receive instead is calcitonin, I'm going to stop breaking down bone tissue. Who can remember from the guided lesson which gland in the body makes calcitonin? Does anyone remember reading about that? Yeah, calcitonin is made by the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland. Thyroid gland is different from the parathyroid gland. The thyroid gland is this butterfly-shaped pink one. And the parathyroid glands are these little ones that are actually embedded in the backside of the thyroid gland. So two different glands that send messages, two different messages that they send, leads to different effects on my osteoclast cells. So Nicole asked an important question. Here's what we'll end on. Nicole asked if the osteoblasts get any messages during this process. The osteoblasts don't hear the message parathyroid hormone. They don't hear the message calcitonin. So this whole process of regulating blood calcium levels, we don't actually have an effect on the osteoblasts. The best way to think about, though, how slowing down osteoclasts lowers my blood calcium is to think about that person that you work with or that you worked with in the past, the person who's like super lazy on the job. When they decide to be super lazy and pull out their phone and sit down instead of helping customers, it makes it look like you're working so much harder just because they stopped working. So when we're thinking about calcium homeostasis, when we're thinking about what's happening with the cells, just think about how normally, remember we said normally we form bone and we break it down at the same rate. If I change the rate that I'm breaking down my bone, if I use calcitonin and I stop breaking down bone, it makes it look like I'm building more bone because my osteoblasts just keep chugging along. My osteoclasts got lazy. They stopped working. So that's when we think about this calcium homeostasis, we're not talking to the osteoblasts. They got their head down. They're doing their job. It's just the osteoclasts that we might tell to stop working. Or we might tell them that they need to start working harder. If I don't have enough calcium, work harder. If I have too much calcium, stop working. We gotta slow this mess down. So the question is, the parathyroid gland is what I use when I have too much calcium, and the thyroid is what I used when there's not enough. That's correct. Yes. Two different things release messages depending on what's going on with my calcium. So if I don't have enough calcium, that's going to activate the parathyroid glands to spit out parathyroid hormone. If I have too much calcium, that's going to activate the thyroid gland to spit out calcitonin. So yes, I use different effector glands to make those things happen. Definitely. Any other last minute questions? Yes, Jessie.
So can your thyroid gland have an effect or cause you to have osteoporosis?
So that save for tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Okay.
So thyroid gland and parathyroid gland and their role in the diseases. That's a great question. I like where your thinking is going. So remind me of that question again tomorrow, and we'll definitely talk about it some more tomorrow. Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
Perfect. All right. Well, I'm probably going to call that a day for today. We can definitely tomorrow go back over this cycle if there's still specific questions we have. Do your best between now and tomorrow to try to work through that activity about skeletal system disorders so that we can look at that more extensively. We will also take some time tomorrow to talk about things like orthodontia, talk about things like going into space, how all of those kind of things can have an effect on bone density. So I'm going to go ahead and pause our recording, and I'll stick around for questions for a couple of minutes here.